Okay, so today we're diving into this really fascinating new paper that says Australia is standing at a major crossroads. For decades, the path to getting richer seemed pretty simple: just add more people. But what if that whole economic engine is starting to sputter out? We're going to break down the argument that Australia's future now depends on a big switch, away from just getting bigger and towards getting smarter.
So here's the game plan for how we'll walk through the paper's argument. We'll kick things off with a pretty surprising paradox. Then we'll look at the real-world costs that aren't always obvious, explore the different path that's being proposed, and wrap up with the massive choice this leaves for the country. And this is the question that's right at the heart of everything. It's challenging a huge, long-held assumption in Australian economics that if you grow the population, everyone automatically gets more prosperous. But, what's the data actually telling us?
Well, here's the bombshell. Get this. While the total economy, the big number you hear on the news, has been growing, on an individual level, for the average person, things have actually been going backward. This chart shows what's being called a per capita recession. That's 4 straight quarters where each person's slice of the economic pie has actually been shrinking. And that's the paradox we need to understand.
So how is that even possible, right? How can the economy grow while living standards fall? Well, this first part of the paper really unpacks the mechanics behind this very counterintuitive trend. The key idea here is a term called capital shallowing. Now, I know, it sounds super technical, but the concept is actually pretty simple. Picture a workshop. If you keep hiring more and more workers, but you don't buy any new tools or machines, then each worker has less equipment to use. They can't be as productive. Well, the authors of this paper are basically saying that's what's happening to the entire Australian economy. And you can see how this chain reaction gets started. First, high migration leads to a rapid boom in the number of workers. But investment in the tools of the economy, technology, machinery, infrastructure, it just can't keep up with that pace. So you end up with less capital for each worker. That drags down productivity, and at the end of the day, it's what causes real wages and living standards to just flatline. And look, this isn't just some abstract theory in a textbook, right? The paper argues that this growth model has some really serious, real-world consequences, hidden costs that we're all paying. So let's take a look at what those are for housing, infrastructure, and the environment. The housing crisis is probably the most obvious one. This number is just incredibly stark. Nationally, only 14% of homes sold last year were actually affordable for household earning a median income. Just think about that. That's a huge blow to a core part of the Australian dream. And this is not a new problem. This chart shows a total collapse over 30 years. Back in the mid-90s, if you were a median income family, you could afford about half the homes for sale. Today, it's a tiny fraction of that. The paper makes a direct line from this to the immense demand pressure created by rapid population growth.
And it's not just about housing. The analysis also points to population growth acting as a kind of threat multiplier for the environment. I mean, we're talking about the world's driest inhabited continent. More people means more pressure on water, more land clearing for suburbs, and a higher energy demand that makes hitting those climate goals that much harder. It basically turns up the heat on every single environmental challenge.
Okay, so if the current model is creating all these headaches, what's the alternative? This is where the paper proposes a really fundamental shift, moving away from a quantitative model, just adding more people, to a qualitative one, built on better ideas, a smarter economic engine. You can see here the two paths forward are just completely different. On the left, you've got the current model, driven by adding people and measured by the overall GDP. On the right, you have the proposed model, which is driven by productivity, measured by GDP per person, and well-being. The goal is to separate growth from using more resources. It's really about working smarter, not just bigger. But of course, switching to an innovation-led economy is not easy. And the analysis points to this one huge roadblock, what it calls Australia's innovation paradox. The country is fantastic at the input side of things, research, brilliant ideas, but really struggles with the output, turning those ideas into commercial products and economic value. Let's just use AI as an example, because it's a great one. Over the past decade, Australian researchers published more than 93,000 AI-related papers. I mean, that is a world-class, massive research output. But that's only half the story. Because this is the other half. Over that exact same period, only around 4,000 AI patents were actually filed. And this huge gap between knowledge and commercialization, that's the core of the challenge. Australia is brilliant at inventing stuff, but not so great at turning those inventions into new industries. And the authors argue a big reason for this gap is a kind of policy blind spot. The focus is always on these moonshot inventions, the kind of thing that's only relevant to 1 or 2% of elite firms. But for the other 98% of businesses out there, the real progress comes from simply adopting technologies that already exist. So the key takeaway here is that the biggest opportunity might not be in inventing more, but in just getting better at using what's already been invented. So this all leads us to the final, and maybe the toughest question of all. If the current model has so many downsides, why does it stick around? This last section of the paper really gets into the politics and the money that keep the status quo chugging along. The analysis points to something it calls the growth lobby. This is basically a powerful group of interests from sectors like property, construction, and big retail, who all directly benefit from having more consumers and more demand for things like housing, no matter what the wider impact is on the economy or society. And the paper's argument here boils down to this fundamental misalignment. A relatively small group gets all the concentrated financial benefits from high population growth, but the costs, things like crazy housing prices and sitting in traffic for hours, those get spread across the entire community. The benefits are privatized, but the costs are socialized. And this has a very real social consequence. The paper shows that as people start to feel the squeeze on their own living standards, their trust in the system that's driving it all starts to wear thin. And this isn't about people being anti-immigration. It's about the real negative impacts they're feeling from how the whole thing is being managed. And you can actually see this playing out in the data. Polling from the Scanlon Foundation shows that in just 1 year, the percentage of Australians who think the immigration intake is too high jumped a lot. The paper argues this isn't some rejection of multiculturalism, it's a totally rational response to the pressures people are feeling in their everyday lives.
Which brings us right back to where we started, to that fundamental choice. The paper really leaves us with this provocative question. It argues that just continuing down the same old path, growth through more numbers, comes with fewer benefits and higher costs every year. The alternative, a future built on innovation, on productivity, on ideas, it's harder, no doubt, but it might be the only sustainable path forward. The question is, which one will Australia choose?